Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hi, everybody. I'd like to start the session tonight by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also to greet and acknowledge any other First Nations people who might be here with us today. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. This land was stolen and never ceded. My name's Felicity Blake. I'm your host for this evening. I'm a member of the OzDox committee. It's such a joy to be a part of. I'm a documentarian and social impact campaign producer. I also produce a podcast on an ongoing basis called The Periodic Table of Awesome, which is a fan podcast, but I'm also a documentarian, so I like documentary podcasting as well. Tonight we're going to be speaking with Kate Montague, Ruby Jones, Sabrina Organo, Alex Stewart, and we have an audio update from Hedley Thomas, the producer and presenter of The Teacher's Pet, which many of you may have heard of. So please, everybody, make our panellists welcome. Just before we jump into the podcast discussion tonight, a quick academic discussion about documentary and defining some different types of factual storytelling. It's a bit of a nerdy academic discussion, but it's important to documentarians politically because in documentary making for the screen, the definition of what a documentary is and isn't can really have a substantive impact on what gets funded. So some of you are professional documentarians, so bear with us if we're rehashing information that's really familiar to you. This is more for a general audience. The term documentary was created or coined by a person who was at the time a film critic, John Grierson, in 1926 in his review of Moana. No, not that Moana. A documentary called Moana that was made by a filmmaker who also made Nanook of the North. And Grierson described documentary as the creative treatment of actuality. So it's a fairly broad definition which has resulted in a lot of debate and evolution over the decades. Although if we want to get academic about it, a Polish filmmaker and writer called Bolesław Matuszewski had actually explored these concepts of what a documentary is and how documentary can be recorded by filmmakers and turned into a piece of entertainment in 1898 in France. So it's been a discussion since the medium was invented about what constitutes a documentary. Sometimes we have to have arguments in our industry about what a documentary is and isn't. A documentary is not reality television, which is a whole other minefield. We have debates about whether factual entertainment is a documentary. We also talk about how journalism and investigative journalism might not necessarily be defined as documentary under ordinary circumstances either, but particularly as we have reached the era in the last 10 years or so of convergence, thanks to digital media, we have traditional documentarians who might have taken a very classical approach and made a film or a product for the silver screen or the TV screen, experimenting with new forms and new ways of telling a story. There's a lot of ways to skin a factual cat. It might be immersive documentary, perhaps we're using immersive 360 or virtual reality. Maybe it's a podcast, maybe it's a multimedia project. There's all different kind of ways to approach this, but at the end of the day, the facts are the heart of the story. And so all of these different creators here tonight take slightly different approaches that sometimes vary from the classical definition of documentary, but there's something from each one of these experts that we can bring to our documentary making practice. And if you're not necessarily a maker, but you're just here as a fan, I'm sure you'll derive a lot from hearing these artists talk about the work that they've made. So to start with, I would love to introduce you to Kate Montague. Kate is the director and founder of Audiocraft. Audiocraft hosts a yearly festival for audio creators, and they make podcasts through their agency. As a producer and executive producer, Kate's worked on audio projects for Audible, the ABC's Earshot, This Is About, Pocket Docs and Long Story Short programs, the CBC's Love Me podcast and NPR's Snap Judgment. She's also led podcast workshops at the Sydney Opera House, Screen Queensland, Spotify and the New South Wales Centre. Welcome, Kate Montague.
Thank you.
Can you tell us more about what Audiocraft is and does? Because you do live events, you produce podcasts, you're kind of experts in the field. Tell us about that.
So Audiocraft is a thing that I started almost 5 years ago as an idea with my co-founder Jess Binneth, and at that time we were both creators, like producers in our own right. Jess was working at the ABC. I was freelance producing documentaries for the ABC, but also working on commercial projects and stuff for, making things for people overseas and shows overseas. But I think Audiocraft really came out of what we felt was a lack in the community as a place for creators in the audio podcast and audio space to kind of come together and talk about craft and get really nerdy about what we were doing. And the podcast industry at that time, what was this, 2016? I'm really bad at math, sorry, one of the years, was sort of like everyone was talking about it. It was this next hot thing, and there was like lots of talk about all the opportunities, but not really clear paths of like how to access those opportunities, but also how we could get better at what we did, which was kind of at that time very new. So we created Audiocraft as a festival, which was really to bring these creators together from community broadcast, public radio, commercial and independent podcasters. And it was sort of this idea of creating a bit of a Switzerland, I guess, for these like cross-sector people to come together and just share ideas and share skills and a bit of a networking exercise. So we've had our fourth festival and
that's just June. Occurred here at Afters,
is that right? Yes, we held it here in Afters in this very room, was one of a few of the sessions. So and then from the festival, and then I guess in parallel with the growth in the industry, we started to get a lot of work coming our way, like people saying we want to make a podcast, but we have no idea, where to go or how to find the creators or producers to work on it. So there we started the agency, which is sort of our production arm, and that's 2 and a bit years old now. And the agency, we have 20 plus producers that we work with. And we're doing a variety of content. We're making big long-form original, like for people like Audible, but we're also doing workshops, consulting, we're doing branded content, we're working with not-for-profits, government organisations, and like no one job is like the other, but there's like a thing, I guess, where audio skills are in demand, and Audiocraft has sort of become a place where people can come and, they want to make a thing, they can come and work with us. So we collaborate with a lot of organisations. So yeah, that's the agency, and so we've kind of morphed, I guess, and we change a lot and still are, but definitely kind of changing and growing in response to the changing and growing of an industry and general interest, I guess, in audio.
Do people usually come to you at Audiocraft because they're fans of podcasts and they say, I want to make one of these? What brings people to you?
I think people come to us when they don't have the skills themselves. So we'll have a lot of organisations will come to us and be like, we want to make a thing. Can we have help? And we will put together the team and we help like develop, research, shape it, record it, package it, like all the technical kind of stuff. But we're also getting a lot of interest just from storytellers. Like we're getting a lot of people approaching us now who have great ideas that they want to create, like develop and pitch into potential distributors. So we're kind of doing a few more of those partnerships where we're currently developing some ideas and pitching them in and collaborating with great storytellers. So I guess we bring storytelling and sound kind of expertise, but we're kind of natural collaborators. Like we enjoy just working with, different storytellers who have great ideas. So I guess those are the people that are coming to us.
By way of example for one of those, one of my favourite colleagues, Jackie Turner, who's a documentarian and impact producer as well, created the impact campaign for the documentary film Ghost Hunter that you might have seen at the Sydney Film Festival a couple of years ago, which is a very powerful film involving not just paranormal investigation, but the discovery that sometimes the ghosts that haunt us are really inside ourselves. And just recently, a podcast that is telling the story in a transmedia way on a different platform, new parts of the story, and unpacking it from a different audience approach has been released through Audible, and you were involved in that.
Yeah, so do we have time to talk about it as a case study?
Why not?
It was a really interesting...
the leader?
I'll introduce it and then maybe we'll play it. But it was a really interesting collaboration because I have a background in documentary film. I always thought I'd be in documentary film, and then I kind of like segued into audio because of its accessibility and the excitement that I kind of gradually grew for audio. But so this was like a dream. It was like a collaboration with filmmakers. I was like, oh, these are my people. But so Jackie and Ben Lawrence, who is the director and producer of the film, I think they secured some long-range marketing funding through Screen Australia. And they wanted to make some short kind of podcast piece as promotional kind of material. And so we kind of got together and talked about like how could some of the unused or extended kind of story that wasn't in the final feature film be used for this kind of promotional. But then of course, like once we all got together, we all got really excited about the broader story and it became a lot bigger than 5-minute pieces, which I think is what we were initially talking about for that long range. So what we did is we kind of, and I hope this is okay to talk about out loud, but we sort of used that funding to go into development, and Audiocraft and Ghost Hunter kind of collaborated. We got in a room, we like hashed the story out, pulled it apart, put it back together in terms of like a long form series. So we were kind of looking at how we could explore certain characters that weren't maybe as developed in the film, or were there kind of like little tangents. And obviously the timeline of that film had extended beyond the film. So there were kind of plot points that we could pick up on that kind of went beyond the film, which was really interesting to us because a lot had happened since. So we did that development, and then we put together a treatment and we took it to Audible and we pitched it in as an idea, and it was commissioned at the time by Jessie Cox, who was the head of original content at Audible. And then from there we kind of went through it was a very long and protracted experience, and probably one that we thought was going to be paint by numbers. We were like, yeah, it's just like take this film material and make a podcast with it. But we learned a lot about how much more complex that process is. But it was a really interesting collaboration in terms of like reimagining an already like an existing story for audio, and what was going to be special about the audio, and how was it going to sit alongside a film and not be the same but complement. And yeah, it was a really interesting process. The trailer is what we have to listen to. That was all.
Hey Jason, my name is Ben Lawrence. I'm a filmmaker in Sydney. I first came across Jason in my local paper. He called himself a ghost hunter.
The first ghost I ever saw was my brother Peter's.
I could tell there was more to his story.
Right, 2 at a time.
Come on, Ben.
But if I'd known this call would lead to 7 years of hunting down ghosts and untangling Jason's dark past, I wonder if I would have picked up the phone in the first place.
Did you hear that?
Yep, something over here.
Speak to you soon, bye. Ghost Hunter, an Audible original.
So I guess you can hear there, it's Ben Lawrence, the filmmaker who became the narrator. And the film, has anyone seen the film? Okay, so you know it's Ben made that as an OzDoc. He's very kind of behind the camera and not very present. He comes a little bit more present in the film as it goes along, and his relationship with Jason deepens. But he was the material that we had, he's not there a lot. He's off mic, or even the way he interviewed in studio, it was kind of really Errol Morrissey, kind of like off mic kind of interviews. So the key difference with the podcast was, which leans much more into podcast format and audio format, which is more narrator-led and one person talking to one person. Like it's a much more intimate exchange. So we had to really bring Ben to the fore. And so the podcast is heavily written, and he worked very closely with Jess Binneth, who was the lead producer and writer, with Ben. And yeah, so it's quite different in terms of tone and style, which was exciting for us. Yeah,
and it's interesting how that particular film is one of those extraordinary projects that starts off being about one thing and then unfolds into Chinese boxes within boxes. Of revealing more elements of story, and that kind of structure in an investigation really is one of the reasons I think for the popularity of the true crime genre. Just stepping back to where this whole podcast thing came from, the term podcast was coined 15 years ago, back in 2004. And back then they attracted a very, very niche audience, particularly in Australia. But then a couple of things happened. There was a technological innovation, so iPods, iPhones, particularly iPod, which is where the podcast came from. But then there was a really breakout hit
Serial,
which was a true crime story, and that has kind of opened the floodgates for a lot of crime storytelling. It's interesting how Ghost Hunter can sort of fall into that genre. Do you feel that it's a true crime story, an investigation? How would you frame it in terms of the genre that it falls into?
I mean, it is true crime because it's about...
It involves a crime.
It involves a crime. But I feel like, well, I'm of course I'm biased, but I think it's a unique approach to a true crime in that what we explored, and particularly in the podcast, we explored more of the voices of the women and the victims in that story. And we were able to kind of bring them out because we had 4 hours, not an hour or an hour and a half. We had more time. So we were able to kind of explore more nuance, I think, in the podcast in that respect. But yes, true crime is definitely the biggest genre in podcasting in terms of popularity, and I don't know why that is. I mean, maybe it's like watching the train crash. Like, people love really grim shit, don't they? Like, and I mean, but crime has a great narrative. Like, you know, there's cause and effect and tension and conflict and mystery and questions that are unanswered that need to be found out. So it's kind of like it's a great narrative, a format. But I kind of, I mean, I have many views about true crime, but
unpack some of those.
But I think you would probably class Ghost Hunter in the true crime category. But I guess where we kind of sought points of difference was spending more time with the characters. I think a lot of dead girls, particularly, weren't are not developed as characters in true crime. They're talked about because they're victims, and they're talked about in relation to the crime that sort of took them out of the world. But I think spending more time with families and looking at long-term impacts of trauma and violence is much more interesting to me personally. So they're kind of the true crimes that I gravitate towards, and I think there's some really great examples of that style of true crime that do it really well. And we would hope that, I guess, Ghost Hunter falls within that category.
It's interesting, isn't it, the difference in approaches between some amateur documentaries, and I say that lovingly, so amateur true crime podcasts and documentary style podcasts, is that a lot of the fan-produced true crime pieces often verge on a sort of breathless sensationalism, where with a professionally produced documentary podcast made by journalists, that you tend to see a bit more sensitivity in the approach. If we can't hear that individual's voice or the victim of that crime, we can at least try to elucidate the shape of the voice or build the pieces back around it so that we have an image of that person. Is that your feeling?
Yeah, I think there's some really great journalism and some really great examples of great rigour when it comes to these stories. I think of people like Connie Walker as an incredible producer. She's an Indigenous Canadian woman who reports only on like missing and murdered Indigenous Canadian women. Like, that's her beat. That's all the stories that she investigates. It's incredible. But she's done a series called Missing and Murdered, which is like, I don't know about the title, but there's one, particularly the season 2, which is Finding Cleo. It's like, it starts as like, oh, I'm going to have a true, like, it's another true crime story. But what you learn about stolen generations and intergenerational trauma and the kind of Indigenous Canadian experience is actually really deep and rich, and she kind of pulls you in with a great story, but you kind of end having learnt something and changing the way you think about something, which is great storytelling or documentary making or whatever at the best of times. But I think, they're the ones that I respect the most, I guess.
On that note, I would like to introduce you to our second panellist, Ruby Jones. Ruby's an award-winning investigative journalist who's worked across Australia. She started her career reporting on crime and justice in the Northern Territory before joining Triple J as the news host on The Breakfast Show. Ruby's work has appeared across ABC Digital and on the ABC's flagship TV current affairs programs 7:30 and Lateline. And I'm a big fan of Ruby's work on Season 2 of ABC's Unravel True Crime series, which is called Barrenjoey Road. Welcome, Ruby.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. So I guess my background is very much a news background. I spent 4 or 5 years in newsrooms in Darwin, in Adelaide, in Sydney, and at Triple J. So when I started Barrenjoey Road last year, I'd never spent so much time on one project before. And Barrenjoey Road is unusual, and I think it might be the only time this has been done in Australia, maybe even the world, but we tried to make a TV documentary series and a podcast documentary series at the same time. So we were simultaneously, every interview that we did, we were bearing in mind that we were doing it both for TV and for the podcast as well. And all of our pre-production had that in mind as well. The way that I got involved was kind of unusual. The story itself that we were investigating was the disappearance of a girl called Trudy Adams who lived on the northern beaches in the late 1970s. And that was sort of the starting point. But we knew before we started that there was a lot more to the case. We knew that there were many other women who'd been attacked. We knew who the main suspect was. And we knew that he was suspected of having this close relationship with a senior New South Wales Crime Commission figure. So we knew that there was quite a lot there for us to delve into. And essentially, I guess, we filmed and recorded everything right from the very beginning. So we had the inquest findings. The show had been commissioned. It was brought to the ABC by a production company. They wanted to make the TV, and the ABC said, well, we want to do the podcast side of it. But they needed someone to host both. And I ended up being the person that did that. All of our pre-production was filmed, so like us sitting in an office kind of looking through this case. It was almost, sometimes it felt like I was in a reality TV show about me doing my journalism, which I found so uncomfortable.
Because you are a character in it, Ruby, aren't you, in the series and in the podcast as the presenter, and we're hearing your voice and your views on what you're investigating. So how was that for you?
It was really hard. I found it so confronting because I'm used to sort of being the person on the other side of the camera, asking questions and having other people tell me what they think. And so for me, it kind of went against a lot of my training, I guess, to insert myself into a story in this way. And I wanted to be so sure of everything before I said anything about it, but you can't be sure of anything at the start of an investigation. So there was, I had to kind of let go of control a bit and allow things to unfold, which was hard. But, it was, the other difficulty about it was that we sort of dived in the middle, but, our end, what we made in the end, both the documentary and the podcast has a beginning, middle and end, right? But the actual process of pre-production and production, which all melded into one, just felt like a total overwhelming mess is the wrong word, but it was just, we were navigating incredibly difficult journalistic territory, when you're talking about things like potential police corruption, and if you're looking at, suspicious relationships. There was a lot of really heavy-duty journalism that we were kind of trying to wade through and unpick and put together. And then there were also these really difficult interviews that we were doing with people who had been affected along the way by the crimes that this man, who I think probably killed Trudy Adams and probably attacked a lot of other people, had done. So yeah, it was a huge project. It took up the better part of a year, and it gave me a lot of insight, I think, into how different making a TV documentary is as opposed to making a podcast. There are huge differences, and the things that I think made the TV that we made strong were really different to what made the podcast strong in a lot of ways.
What are some of the things that stood out to you in that respect?
I think it really made me appreciate the impact of a moment that you film, like a real moment, like someone uncovering something or discovering something or being there, and being able to see that on someone. Those were the strongest parts of it sounds vague, but I hope you know what I mean. But those were the strongest parts of the TV that we made. But that doesn't translate to a podcast. if you can't hear it, there's no real impact at all.
That said, I think that you've done an extremely good job on that podcast, and I wonder, Alan, whether the Phantom of the Cinema, whether we could play the couple of minutes from Ruby's episode 3 called The Hunting Ground, which is recorded on location and gives you a bit of a feeling of what she was doing.
This is an ABC podcast.
Trudy Adams disappeared in June 1978, and her disappearance set something in motion because in the days and the weeks afterwards, other women began to come forward. One by one, they approached police, all telling a similar, terrible story. It turns out, for years, young women on the northern beaches had been targeted. They were kidnapped while hitchhiking or walking home, driven to a hidden spot of bushland, blindfolded and raped. The place they were taken is a half-hour drive away from the coast, into a national park, an isolated spot where they could hear the sound of high-voltage power lines in the distance.
You can kind of hear them humming. I mean, on one hand, it's, a beautiful, peaceful woodland on a balmy night, but the second that you start to think about the sorts of things that happened here, you get a completely different feeling. Even the drive here was a bit scary. You go down these little bumpy dirt tracks. You're very quickly out of street lamps, out of houses, there's nothing around. You go from a main road to feeling really isolated really quickly. And that's pretty scary. It's really sick to think about the way that they saw this area as a hunting ground to pick up young girls who were just trying to get home. It's a really calculated way of attacking women. And it doesn't happen that often. But it was happening often around here. It was happening, with regularity. It was happening to lots of women. It's exactly what you're taught to be scared of as a girl, that men who you don't know can spring out of nowhere and abduct you and rape you, and that's what you're scared of. That's exactly what you're scared of when you're a teenage girl or, any age woman. That's the nightmare. That's the total fear.
Thanks, Al. Well done, Ruby. What did you later find in that area?
We went back to that particular spot in the northern beaches quite a lot, actually. And we got in touch with a ranger, actually one of Trudy's friends told me to call this guy, and he had been out there around the time that Trudy disappeared, and I think he had stumbled upon it was a crime scene where I believe a lot of the girls who were attacked by these two men were taken at the time. So there was a lot of really awful things that were happening up on the northern beaches at the time, and I think for me it was that slow sort of realization that not only were all of these things happening, nothing was really done about it. I had this moment quite kind of midway through investigating where I got some of the old police reports that were made by some of the women who were attacked. We know that at least 19 women were, but I believe it's much, much more than that. And the first woman who was attacked by these men in 1971, she went to the Manly police station to report what had happened on the night that it happened, and the police report just says, the complaint's doubtful, her clothes aren't ripped, it doesn't look like anything happened, and they just sent her home again. And so that was the very first attack, and there was another one 5 days later, and they progressed like that all through the 70s. So I think it was just that, I had a real sense of wanting to... I think I know who the perpetrators were, but I was also trying to get to the bottom of why those attacks weren't taken seriously, why these women weren't believed, why no one seemed to care that this was happening. And that was really driving me, I think, for a lot of my investigating.
One of the things that's notable in both the podcast and the television series is there's a scene where you and your co-presenter, who you might like to talk about as well, are looking through an old newspaper at the missing persons report and noticed an interesting juxtaposition of images. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we went to the State Library and we were looking back through all the coverage of Trudy's disappearance at the time, and it was headline news. There was quite a lot of victim blaming. You know, she was called Hitchhike Girl. And when we were flicking through, you know, I hadn't seen this before. It's changed now, but there was always a page 3 girl. So you'd have, you know, this picture of Trudy Adams. It was always her passport photo because she was just about to go overseas. She just turned 18, so they used this passport photo. And then right next to her, there's I think it was the one that ended up in the film was this girl called Maureen. I think she was wearing leopard print, and it was just, but it happened every time. It was like page 3 girl Trudy, and it was like you were either, you know, the dead missing girl, or you were the page 3 girl, and those just seemed to be the 2 roles that existed. There was never any female bylines on any of the stories. It was all male journalists, and so, you know, I kind of know that that's what it was like in the 70s, you know, intellectually, but to actually see it was quite confronting. And I was working with a really experienced journalist on this. His name's Neil Mercer, and he's been a crime journalist for forever. I shouldn't say that. He's not that old, but he was definitely around in the 70s and 80s. And so we developed this really close relationship because I think he was, you know, giving me a lot of knowledge about what it actually was like in the 70s and 80s. He did have that wealth of knowledge, but I think he was also realising from talking to me how awful and misogynistic a lot of it was. And I think he knew that, but it was seeing it through my eyes that really brought it home. So we were kind of exchanging a lot of ideas and kind of changing each other's minds about stuff a lot, which was really, really interesting.
That historical perspective of, or perhaps a modern perspective on historic crimes, really provides us with an opportunity to reflect. And it's interesting in some podcasts, presentations, how certain presenters will take a particularly lyrical or sensitive or poetic approach to the material, and others will take the breathless, sensationalised, morbid kind of approach. But something I really appreciated about all of these artists' work is the voice of women and the perspective that a female producer and presenter brings, and it's something that we can explore a bit as we go forward. But coming to historical crimes and modern perspectives on them, I'd like to introduce you to Sabrina Organo, our third panellist. Sabrina is a factual producer who's spent the last couple of decades working across TV, film, art and installation projects, and most recently she's focused on producing exhibition content, including for the Australian Museum, the National Museum of Australia, the Bradman Museum, the Newcastle Museum and the Australian Centre for Design. As the creative producer of multimedia at the State Library of New South Wales, Sabrina produced the exhibition Dead Central, which is on display in the library until May 2020. I took my mum and dad, you should all go. And its companion podcast, The Burial Files. And her video work is showing in A Midnight Visit, which is the immersive theatrical experience by Broad Encounters that's currently touring Australia. Welcome, Sabrina. So, Sabrina, you have also a multi-platform situation going on here. You have the podcast, The Burial Files, and the exhibition at the State Library of New South Wales, Dead Central, which is also immersive and interactive and technologically based. People don't necessarily realise that you can go to the State Library of New South Wales and do a cool thing like this. And also that there is this great podcast about how there used to be a really fairly primitive colonial cemetery under Central Station, and everybody had to be exhumed and taken somewhere else, and that the little train station next to Central Station is Mortuary Station, and it has a lot of lovely ghoulish features and all these exciting things that you can explore. How exciting to be able to share that with the listening public.
Yes, it's incredibly exciting. It's not a story that a lot of people know. I certainly didn't know it before the curator, Elise Edmonds, found this incredible collection of glass plate negatives down in the stacks of the library, hundreds of them that were taken just before the cemetery was exhumed by a couple who lived nearby in Surrey Hills, who were they were some of the founding members of the Royal Australian Historical Society, just real local history junkies. It was around the time of Federation, and this sort of Australian identity was emerging, and this idea of
us having a history, I suppose, that was worth collecting and recording, Australia having a history that was worth collecting and recording. Anyway, so Elise found all these beautiful photographs, and some of them had been published before, but not all of them had been seen, and so she kind of wanted to create this exhibition about it, and so I worked with her to create an exhibition that's a bit of a different approach. I don't actually know if it's been done before. I imagine it probably has, but often you'll go to an exhibition, and if it's audio-driven, it will be a guide that sort of tells you what to look at and is explaining what you're looking at it as you're looking at it. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted to tell a narrative story that was highly emotionally engaging, because the story is, well, I suppose it's about trying to bridge the gap of, between present and past, and create an emotional connection to the past, and the fact that we have all these layers of history under our feet that we don't even really acknowledge or know about. And so we created this audio story world, I suppose you could say, which is narrative. It's chapterised, and you access the audio via a URL, and you walk through the exhibition and listen to it, and the objects that you see that are from the collection are evidence, effectively, of the story you're hearing. You're not told what to look at, but you can sort of look at the things and piece them together, and quite often people find that as they're looking at a document, they'll hear the words spoken. It's a dramatisation of a historical record, and they'll be able to piece it all together and understand how it all fits. And then the podcast, normally what the library would do is have a lot of curatorial text in an exhibition. We didn't want to do that. So we just let it be with the audio. It's only 35 minutes, the duration of the exhibition, because we wanted to keep it at a contained duration that would be, reasonable for people to spend that amount of time in the exhibition. But there was so much research that we'd done. We spent about 2 years putting it together, and so much rich information, and so many historians who are working in this space at the moment. And so and then very serendipitously, as I was working on the first episode, writing the first episode of the podcast, of course, the Metro Project unearthed the first of the human remains that they found under the tram lines that they were digging on Chalmers Street. And so we were like, So we sort of then were able to really link the present with the past, because these remains are actually being dug up still as we're speaking, like there's archaeologists working on the Metro dig. And we were able to go down there in the room, record, and the whole sort of, I suppose, historical community and Sydney Trains, and it happened to be Mortuary's 150th anniversary this year as well. And so all these strange serendipitous things happened that we hadn't planned at all, that meant that we could really bring this story to life in a real way and tie it very much to the present. And the podcast takes a completely different form. The audio in the exhibition is very emotional. It's narrative, it's story. The podcast is factual. It includes interviews with experts and visits to different locations, and it's quite a different property. We wanted it to be able to stand alone, and for people who had been to the exhibition to be able to enjoy both. And also a lot of people to try to also reach a broader audience. A lot of people, we serve the whole of New South Wales as the State Library of New South Wales, and a lot of people can't get to our exhibitions, so it was a way to try to reach out to people. Even though it's a very Sydney-centric story, there's still a lot of interest in there. Hopefully it doesn't turn people off in that respect.
And being a matter of public record for the Library of New South Wales, this is quite a classic documentary approach. It's very factual. You're using, as you say, expert voices from historians and primary source documents, and some lovely reenactments and voiceovers from people playing characters whose stories are told, and sometimes whose graves appear in this story. Yeah. In terms of how you repurpose material for the podcast and the exhibition, we have a bit of behind the scenes audio, I think, available. Shall we play that? Or...
What's the year on it? I can't even remember what the year is.
It's near the time when the cemetery closed, so it's the 1860s, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. What if they were butted like
Do
that?
they actually align?
Today I'm down in one of the library's conservation labs looking at items that relate to the Devonshire Street Cemetery.
Is this a similar period, this one?
It looks like
this
is the end of the...
this is an ivory engraving.
18th century.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Is the hair in there? Helen, can we have a look at it again?
Yes.
I've spent years researching the library's collection, compiling lists of materials, of evidence that could help tell the story of the cemetery in an exhibition.
So these will be displayed together, right?
So
that one as well?
List or not?
Yeah.
Yes, this was SPF.
Less than a year away from opening, it's time to make final selections and to start figuring out how to fit it all into the gallery space.
Do you want to have a look at the image on the other side?
This one as well.
Do you want to just pair those together, or is it overkill?
I could really see that nice custom case.
Custom case, you said.
I mean, it is such a library.
Our 3D designer Paul is here, along with Sabrina, the exhibition's producer, and Helen and Kath from the conservation team, who take measurements, assess each item's condition and decide on any necessary treatment.
204 has a little bit of damage on one side, just like a tear repair kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
These sessions go for hours, but we seem to have cracked the back of it.
Okay, amazing. So the last thing is the government.
Oh, this giant thing.
One of the items of particular interest to me today is one we haven't seen before.
So maybe if I hold it.
It's a thick leather-bound volume of yellowed pages.
We may need to look at this whole thing. So look at all this.
Oh my God.
These are the recordings of the votes and proceedings of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly from 1861.
So this is the correspondence. So we're looking for Reverend Walsh.
I promise these are way more interesting than they sound, especially when you get to the first of the 323 documents submitted to the government over a 15-year period, addressing the state of Sydney's burial grounds.
Oh, here we go. W.H. Walsh to Bishop of Sydney, 10th of April 1849, page 19.
Awesome. It's here that we find some of the earliest reports of the Devonshire Street Cemetery's demise.
Oh, listen to this bit.
It is now scarcely possible to dig a grave without disinterring the remains of dead bodies, and I have myself on several occasions seen the side of coffins projecting at various depths, to the great distress of all right-minded persons.
At the end of our last episode, the first burials were being made in the new Sandhill Cemetery, and it was all about order. 20 years later, the cemetery is in trouble. It's overcrowded, it stinks, and there's something oozing from the walls. How did this happen?
Yeah. Tune in.
Who knew that the library's archives are full of such juicy stuff to dig up, literally?
Well, yeah.
And you have some great stuff in there. So apart from the written records and letters and historical documents, you also have actual artefacts. Have you got any cool ones that you want to tell us about?
That are particularly in the exhibition?
Sure, or in the library right now. I have to say, the first time I saw one of the first tickets that was issued for the first train from Central Station, I don't know what it is about it. It's this little yellow stub, and there's just something a little bit magical about it. I don't know. Look, the photographs, that collection of photographs are just extraordinary. Like these incredible, they were glass plate negatives, and the crispness and the clarity and the detail in these images is just quite breathtaking. Look, I love so many things. The little portrait of one of the women who was buried there. We sort of went through the whole collection trying to find portraits of anybody who'd been buried there, and there's these incredible little ivory miniatures that have been carved, and in the locket sort of arrangement that the little miniature portrait is in has a companion piece of woven hair from the head of the person whose portrait it is, which is so creepy, but so there's this weird, surprising connection that you feel when you see something that personal. And there was a companion portrait of her husband who wasn't buried in the cemetery, so we didn't include it, and we were sort of speculating about whether or not, because they both had this woven pieces of hair, and whether or not their hair had been woven together, and you start to sort of ask all these questions about, like every single item in the exhibition is sort of a doorway into its own story, which is what we do actually say in the script. And it really is the case that with every single document, with every single newspaper article, with every single photograph, there's something more to be learnt, and you can go quite deep looking into that. And we've tried to do a little bit of that with the podcast. There's a peculiarity of the podcast medium, isn't there, that it's really immersive, even though this is a whole storytelling medium intended for a mobile platform, and people do it while they're doing something else. people are listening to podcasts while they're commuting, while they're doing the dishes or hanging the laundry or going for a walk or, doing all kinds of stuff. They're still really connecting deeply with these stories and with the storytellers, even when it's a matter of historical fiction. What is it about? How did you translate the intimacy of an old Victorian funerary locket and these fairly dry historical documents to create such moving stories?
Oh, I don't know. How did I do that? I guess the individual... I suppose that I was trying to do so many things with the podcast, and perhaps I tried to do too much, but with that clip that we just heard there, I was sort of trying to create a personal connection not with the library too as an organisation, because it's not really a place that people necessarily think of to go and see exhibitions or to hear a podcast
building
from.
A brand a little bit here as well too.
Well, yes, I suppose in a way that's true, or trying to dismantle a brand, I think. I think the library's thought of as anyway, it's thought of in lots of different ways, but it's, it can, I think there's a little bit of a perceived stuffiness about it. And sort of trying to break that. I mean, I think we all just sound like massive dorks in that piece, like getting excited about these historical documents, but we are, and there's something really lovely about it, and I was trying to, I don't know how successfully share that process and communicate that to people. I'm not answering your question. As to how we created connection to these people in the past, well, I suppose, to a large extent we allowed the historians who we interviewed to do a lot of that legwork because they know their subject area so well, and they can really unpack the detail of it that sort of puts you at that place in time and allows you to feel a degree of empathy, not necessarily with that person, because there's the historical record has so many gaps in it that you don't really get to dig down or talk to people who have a living memory of it at all, but to still try to create that empathy and to build that idea of place and build that idea of that whole world. And I suppose as the episodes build, I sort of had tried to give as much information as I could about what Sydney was at that time, about what the healthcare system was like, about what the attitude toward mental health was like, about what the freedom of the press was like, about what information people had at their disposal, about how people buried their dead, about how people had that, like, to try to build that whole world so that you could put yourself there to then feel empathy for these people who feel like they're almost characters in a story because you're so divorced from it in time. Does that make sense?
It certainly does. There's a very lively and sensitive unpacking of the information. And now to move on to somebody completely different. We've been through so much death and dismay, and I'd now like to introduce you to Alex Stewart from Low Tox Living, who is much more in the current and lively end of the spectrum. Alex is the author of Low Tox Life and the founder of a thriving online education hub by the same name, which is made up of several e-courses, a podcast, which is one of the highest rating podcasts in the health category in Australia, and she has recipes, she has articles and community action resources for an ever-growing audience of people wanting to be healthier and to make the planet happier and more sustainable. Alex is an educator, a change agent, an author, columnist, speaker and consultant at the forefront of a movement that's non-judgmental and tough on the system that got us here. Alex, what is Low Tox Living?
Do you know, after listening to you three amazing ladies, it honestly makes climate change and human health sound really boring. It's so funny. But, okay, so the way I came to develop the Low Tox Life platform was by no conventional means. I'm not journalist trained, certainly not a documentary filmmaker, although I would like to be one day. I've got a few topics I'd like to dig into. But I took my European political science degree and became a bartender and a singer in nightclubs. So that was that logical step that a lot of us make. Not.
My career trajectory looks like that too.
Yeah, right. And then over the years of my 20s, developed a few health challenges that had me look at things a different way. And by that I mean One of them was chronic tonsillitis, so it got to the point where antibiotics no longer worked. I had been on the strongest, highest ones, and there was that kind of end-of-the-road moment where there's nothing we can do. And then the same thing happened with my menstrual cycle, which just disappeared. 3 years later, to be diagnosed with early onset menopause at 28, with the end of the road, there's nothing we can do. Then sort of starting to sort of wake up to the food system, because I had to change the way I ate to sort out my tonsillitis. And it was incredible, actually. Giving up gluten-containing foods completely eradicated my tonsillitis. I just stopped getting it. And so I was like, how on earth is that? And of course I had to then read ingredients, which meant I actually had to know where my food came from, which meant my head of the environment committee / activist at Greenpeace at uni teenager just woke up again. It's like I just sprang out of nowhere after being quite dormant for most of my 20s and started to ask a shed ton of questions about our food system, about food production originally, but then also into personal care, cleaning products, basically everything we made daily choices around and led into our homes, onto our bodies and inside our bodies, and how it affected us and the planet was starting to really blow my mind.
And you now have an audience of around 70,000 people or so?
Yeah, we reach about 2 million people a month now.
Right, from the podcast and
from
all of the platforms, yeah.
Exactly.
And they're asking a pretty simple question, which is, what's in my food?
What's in my food? What's in my products? How does it affect me? How does it affect the planet? And so I really wanted to take the there's nothing we can do and flip it and ask, well, what can we do? Who in the world believes in possibility and who is actually trying to solve things? So I started to find doctors, various practitioners, for example, on the health topics that went, okay, so you've been told there's nothing we can do there. Let's see what we can do. Got my period back, didn't get tonsillitis. Just crazy things were happening to me. And I thought, I wonder whether there are other people that might be helped by what I've been through. And that's how it originally played out. But of course, you don't want to be the person who has to be sick every time you want to solve a problem. So it was really more about starting to find some of the greatest health challenges that existed and help find the people who could connect the dots for those people who were experiencing those health challenges by sort of, I guess, what you could call non-consensus means. Using anecdote in their personal medical practices rather than waiting for full scientific consensus and double-blind studies before acting because people were desperate. So it was a really exciting thing to start to help people. And the podcast was, I think it was about 3 years ago, early 2016, that I just started to think, no, I really love the idea of bringing someone on a show who we can investigate to the nth degree everything that's in their mind that they know and how they've helped people as a scientist or as a doctor, and really bring to light some challenges that people are facing and start solving those for people. And I can't tell you the amount of lives that have been changed. It's actually, it blows my mind. The amount of couples that get in touch and say, oh my gosh, we heard your show with so-and-so, we decided to make some of the changes, we're having a baby next April, we had gone through every possible means, otherwise told that we're never going to have a baby. So things like that are just sort of standard issue now. It's really quite amazing. It's beautiful to be a part of. And I think what I find really interesting as the environmentalist type who really went into this wanting to do better by the planet with a really big picture focus, I started to realise that because we have so many people chronically ill and in survival mode just getting through the day, it's very hard to get traction on big ideas, big societal shifts that we need to address the climate crisis when people can barely function themselves. Has anyone experienced chronic illness in the audience? So you'll know that feeling, and I've had it myself. Where you're literally just trying to step through the day, not trying to, you can't even read.
One spoon at a time.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so that fascinates me. And then you start to think about the other people who are in survival, financial survival. There's a huge stress with the evaporation of the middle class. And I just think we need to get people out of survival so we can tackle some of the greatest picture survival topics of our time. And so that's why, you know, on the outset it might look like, well, why are they talking about thyroid disease and arthritis? But then they're having a climate change episode. And that might seem really illogical, but it's my kind of master plan to get people out of survival and get the people who are now thriving to be thinking bigger picture. So I intersperse topics along the way. So it really is quite a lucky dip as to what we're going to be talking about on the show. But I try to put a climate positive topic every single month now to really just keep us very can-do on that, because I think anybody who starts caring about their food system, chemicals and cleaning products and how they biodegrade and plastics in the oceans and all of those sorts of things really wants to stay positive right now, because otherwise you can just very quickly get swallowed up into paralysis from all the negativity.
And it's quite a tricky subject to negotiate, isn't it? The format of your podcast is each week you speak to experts in certain fields. A lot of the time these are scientists with highly credentialed individuals, and at other times they might be a bit more experimental in identifying your characters, particularly with your podcast landing in the wellness trend era. How do you make sure that you're not talking to a quack?
Yeah, it's look, I think it's really interesting, because who are we to say who is a quack sometimes if they're having incredible results for a huge group of people? That fascinates me. I've tried some pretty wacky therapies myself along the way out of desperation, you know, just having to break outside of the box, and had incredible results through like extreme meditation practices and all sorts. So I think it's about how you frame it and how you make it. I make it very clear when something is not, shall we say, scientifically researched and backed. Make it very clear that we're dealing with an interesting curiosity versus fact and proven modality, if that makes sense.
Sure, and at the same time it's quite difficult to navigate some of these topical conversations. For example, the Monsanto and glyphosate discussion, which is happening in the international courts and in the press at the moment, about whether that is or is not carcinogenic.
But that's a great example, Felicity, because someone who comes out against Monsanto might be called a quack. However, the budget that they have to discredit people, they literally spend time discrediting people who try to attack them.
Yeah, they have a whole very well-resourced department to do that.
So it's a really interesting time then, you know, where we are in a bit of a who do we believe on certain topics, because there are such strong voices from both sides, and depending on what bubble you're in, literally how your friends talk about things on Facebook, as a great example, can make you start to back beliefs that sometimes aren't even centred on anything if you go deep enough. So it's often a fine line with the bigger topics like that. But with something like glyphosate, I really love bringing on independent scientists who are backed by independent philanthropists or by their own personal funds to look into that topic, because there's so much vested interest in science these days. There are agendas. We can't ignore the fact that there are agendas. So I try to bring a voice to independent scientists wherever possible.
Thank you, Alex. What I would like to do now is address some general questions to the panel about podcasting in a broader sense. And then we're going to hear an update from Hedley Thomas, and after that we'll ask for questions from the audience, just to let you all know how this is going to go. I want to come back to something I mentioned earlier about women's voices and women producers, particularly in podcasting. I tend to find that the technology is pretty accessible, pretty easy to use, and not necessarily gate-kept by the traditional gatekeepers or large budgets which might be required to produce a documentary in a different medium. I'm wondering about your thoughts on that, of being able to, like in Alex's case, you just kicked off and started this yourself. What's your experience around these issues?
we often wait for equality, but something like podcasting means you can just choose to be on that day and no one has to choose a woman to make up the quota. You know what I mean? The woman can just choose herself. So I think it's a really exciting way to bolster women's voices and to remove some of the barriers that exist for more women's voices to be heard.
And you produce your podcast at home. Tell us about your actual recording setup.
So I have a Rode mic. I have one of those actually it was Dion, your partner, who recommended the little shield, because living in a highly dense part of Sydney, there's always someone putting in a new kitchen somewhere. And so I just have one of those sound shields. And then what else do I have? I think it's literally as simple as that. I use GarageBand.
And you interview international callers quite frequently because these are overseas experts. How are you doing that? Using phone or using an app?
I tend to use Zoom. It's probably the most reliable. However, not the most reliable in Australia. So I would use Skype or phone for Australian callers, because our internet is so unexcellent.
It is indeed unexcellent. What about you, ladies? You're coming from a highly budgeted professional recording environment, or not?
No,
Sabrina?
No, I don't even have a little shield. Sorry to say, I've lent you mine. No, I used a Rode mic, like professional mics, and a Zoom recorder, but we didn't have access. We don't have access to a studio, and we didn't have the budget for one. This project didn't really have an allocated budget. I sort of asked for money for it to be professionally mixed. Thankfully, they had the money to be able to do that.
But you have such lovely sound design.
Sorry?
It has such lovely sound design.
Good. We used Sonar, who are just over the road in Fox, and their designer Julian Wessels is amazing. He did the sound design for the exhibition as well, and it's just beautiful. So we were fortunate in that respect, but I have a bit of gear because I usually am making video content, like I make little mini documentaries for exhibitions. If I'm ever making narrative content, that's what it will be. I've never just done audio before, and so I had two little bug mics that I would usually use for that, which proved to be quite useful out and about. But otherwise it was just a shotgun mic and recording in this office space where every time somebody blipped to come in one of the meeting rooms next door, we'd have to stop and start, and it wasn't ideal. But we managed it, and I think it sounds okay. Yeah.
We had, I guess we had the whole setup with us the whole time. So we had the whole crew to make the TV series, and then we just had me with my little Marantz as well. And the difference is amazing, really, in terms of what people will tell you. So I think anyone who's ever made a film or done any kind of video before will know that as soon as you stop recording the interview is when the person just relaxes and starts to tell you what they actually think. And the great thing about podcasting is you're there with your microphone, and so you can kind of get people in a much more relaxed state, and it's a lot easier in that sense. And I was just going to say on the idea of kind of women and podcasting as well, I think it was a very conscious decision with our project that it was hosted by a woman, particularly a young woman as well, because, a lot of these victims traditionally in true crime are young women, and I think it was really important to be able to have someone who just was a bit closer, I guess, and a bit more, maybe I would say more sensitive to about how to talk about stuff like this. And I had noticed a lot of the time that I was the only female voice in the podcast I made, because we were interviewing police officers, and all the police officers from the 70s are men. There's no women. And I noticed in the TV series too, someone else actually pointed this out to me, but because it was Neil and I doing the TV series, we both did a lot of the interviews together. And he's a man in his 60s and I'm a woman in my 20s. And someone who watched the documentary told me, they said whenever you asked a question, the person you were interviewing always answered back to Neil. Like the eye line just went in this triangle. So, these are just, this is just the way the world kind of works. But it was a very...
long, sister.
So it was a conscious thing,
I was very conscious of having female voices, but in the humanities... we're fortunate there are lots of women working in the humanities, and the State Library certainly in terms of content production, and the librarian sector at least, it's very female oriented. I work on a floor with maybe 70 people and 2 of them are men. It's very female dominated, so there's no excuses.
You just had to do it for yourself.
Yeah, but I don't think there are. I don't think there are gatekeepers anymore. It's just do it. Mm-hmm. I felt really free, like I could just do it, and it was wonderful. I think speaking to what you were saying, that I think you get more access. I think people will more readily accept that you can come along. You put a bug on someone, they forget it's there. And we wouldn't have been able to go onto the dig site. We wouldn't have been able to go places with a camera. And the construct of having a camera there is so invasive and so repetitive, and like shooting for sequences. And it's just, I've loved just working with audio. It was so lovely, and I really want to do it again.
Yeah, less technology sort of results in less mediation by technology, and you do get incredibly intimate results.
It's a real
from
producer's medium because of that, because you're not having to worry about that stuff, especially as a shooter producer. When you're out there, you can be there as much as the person that you're with, if you get what I mean. It's more personal for you as well as for the person that you're with, and you. Yeah, and it's all about then getting back into, it's all about the edit and the structure and the story and the writing, and you're not having to worry about, the camera. And I'm just not I found the technical side of it not at all. I mean, I'm sure there's ways I can improve, but it wasn't problematic in the way that I find cameras to be problematic. Anyway, sorry.
No, I think it's true, because I was desperate to make documentaries, but the point of access to get into film and TV is so much harder. And at that point of my career, I could set myself up with an audio kit, like full editing software, everything for under $1,000, and I was off. And all of a sudden, and then I just had access. I didn't need to worry about a crew or logistics. I just literally walk in and just do the interview, and it was the quality of the interviews. I mean, you kind of get drunk on this stuff because you're maintaining eye contact with someone, and they're telling you something that would have taken you a good day to get with a camera. Well, maybe I was not very good with using a camera, but but yeah, I think that point of access around audio is very exciting, and perhaps more women are accessing audio for that reason. But I have to say, the idea of audio being cheap kind of irritates me, because there was a point in my career where I was needed a job or wanted a job and wanted to get paid. And I think this is where you have these incredible accessible platforms, and it's so cheap and I can do it for free. And I feel that there's a point where the limitations really set in terms of how are you going to support yourself as an artist or a creator. So, and then you're getting out there and people are like, oh, I want to make a podcast. You can do that in a couple of days, right? And you're just no. And I feel because of that access and affordability of podcasting, it's now also becoming stigmatised as a really cheap medium.
Absolutely.
Whereas I kind of would like to argue that the level of craft that goes into audio is comparable to all of the others.
Right, and it depends who's doing it too. I mean, anybody can pick up a mobile phone and shoot scenes on it and actually put together a film. It doesn't mean that the film's going to be any good. It might be absolute crap. So because we can afford the technology to do this doesn't necessarily mean that it's a very simple outcome. It depends on who's making the work, right?
Yeah.
What's the expertise of the producer?
Valued. Yeah. Yes, I agree. But I don't know if you guys come up against that, because I think everyone does this. Podcasting is a little more unwieldy. Even when you are opening, when we talk about documentary film, there's genres, there's styles, there's a whole vernacular that you can use to talk about documentary film and TV. Whereas podcasting, we don't have that language, and there are so many different formats, so many different styles and genres, but they're all kind of piled into one big podcast category. So I think that would be great to progress that conversation a little more, would help us around this, because I think why people are making a podcast is very different, what's motivating. Someone might, I think it's really interesting, and I talk to a lot of podcasters who are just lit up and passionate about something that they just want to talk to people about and have conversations, and their podcasts are reaching huge audiences like you. But then there are like investigative or like sound art or like, and they're going to podcast and sound formats for a completely different reason. So I think that's sort of another kind of, I just feel like I'm having a big whinge, but like it's just like another kind of point where we probably need to kind of like progress how we're having those conversations.
So articulating some of the terminology is going to be something that helps, and that's something that happens at Audiocraft Podcast Festival. It's something that happens if you study podcasting and radio production somewhere like AFTRS right here, for example. Something that I want to explore is how do you fund this as an exercise? Alex, in your case, you were a DIY approach, but if I can start with you, Kate, as our resident expert and Audiocraft Podcast Festival producer, can you let us know how people are approaching this? What are some of the platforms? There are newspapers, there are broadcasters. How are people paying for this to happen?
Well, in terms of how a producer's getting paid, or I mean, we don't make money out of a festival, so like you don't make money doing events.
How can you fund a documentary podcast?
A documentary podcast, I mean, Audible at the moment are probably the kind of biggest commissioning kind of person in terms of their budgets. They still have limitations, the budgets in terms of what they want and what you can achieve with that budget. I think there are jobs, like in-house jobs are coming up at like the library, and The Guardian have just hired a whole team. Schwartz Media. Schwartz Media are now doing a daily podcast, and they've got a staff of like, I don't know, 5 people. Mamma Mia. There are other, and then Podcast One, which is like a part of Southern Cross Stereo, are doing a lot of original content. But as to like where to pitch to and how to kind of navigate that, it's a constant challenge, even for us when we're kind of out there doing a lot of work. I think that we should be thinking about pitching overseas and gunning for like making global stories, and I think that's sort of a real parallel in probably TV and film as well. It's like Australians often, like even as a freelancer, you'd always wait until you had the best idea to pitch to the ABC, but I'm always like, nah, just pitch now. Like, don't sit on things or don't wait. It's sort of like being a bit bolder and braver about who you're approaching. And I think we can do that more in podcasting and audio series. Like if they're big ideas and they warrant a bigger budget and they're kind of like a long-form idea, I reckon like Spotify are going to become a big player for sure. Like they've hired their local team, but they're very slow moving because they're a big organisation. Podcast One could potentially take external productions. The ABC maybe might work with external production houses one day in a similar way to the BBC do. In like the BBC and the UK have a thriving industry of independent audio production houses, and that's because they, I feel bad talking about this with the ABC, but they downsize their in-house staff, and that's kind of like driven by public broadcasting, funding, and which is happening here. So perhaps there's an industry for independent production houses that can be partnering with them. That might happen. I don't know. It's a bit of a crystal ball thing, but at the moment, I think some of those bigger international broadcasters is probably where there's more opportunities that we're perhaps been too shy about exploring.
What do you think about some of the international ones like Wondery or Roman Mars's Mob and all of those kind of people? I
mean, one of our Audiocraft producers is here, and we were just talking about this and we're like, where can you pitch the ideas? And it's a thing that we talk about a lot, but we were like, Wondery, Spotify, Gimlet. I mean, Gimlet is a production house in the US that's been bought by Spotify. This is the other thing that's happening. Like these big guys are just hoovering up the whole bloody industry. But as a result, they have budgets, they have the appetite for more content. Like it's this like, we need content, which sounds so gross, but there's also an opportunity there for people who have ideas. So I think it's sort of, but it's hard to know. Like you don't Google, who do I pitch to at Spotify? Like finding out like what they're called, like what's their job title, like it's very it's hard to navigate. It can be quite confusing and it can be quite intimidating for someone from the outside who doesn't kind of, you know, have conversations in the hallways with all these people all the time.
Sure, just like pitching to, you know, in other media, of course, who do I pitch that to at any broadcaster is the eternal question. And Ruby, how did it happen for you at the ABC that this multi-platform project came up? Whose idea was that?
So it was kind of an unusual way for a project to come about because as a journalist, I'm used to having the story myself and pitching it to people, but that's not how this happened at all. It was under a bunch of funding that Michelle Guthrie put in place at the ABC. It was called the Great Ideas Grant gig, and there was a vertical called Unravel True Crime that was created as part of that, and they, for every project that they did, they had a podcast, but they were mostly co-pros. So the first season was a co-production with Australian Story, and they also did a podcast. So that was all in-house. My season was the second season, and the story itself was actually brought to the ABC by a production company, a TV production company. The person who brought it to the production company, I believe, actually came from Four Corners in a kind of weird circle, and I never actually met him, which is so bizarre even now. But it was his kind of story. He brought it to the production company. They had it for a while. I think they were looking for how it could move forward. They brought it to the ABC, and then the ABC said, we want to do that and we want to incorporate it into this kind of Unravel funding and bring it all together. And I think it was quite a good way of making a podcast in that you had all this funding from the TV, and you know, a lot of it was done in tandem. So that's how that one came about. Unfortunately, there's only been a third season of Unravel. A fourth one's coming soon, and I'm not sure how many more there will be. But that was sort of the idea. It was all about, merging it all together and seeing how much we could make, I guess, out of one pile of funding. And it's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. I've been approached by other production companies who I think see podcasting, for better or worse, as a way to do pre-production for a TV series, which I have various thoughts about. But I do think it's interesting because I think if production companies are willing to properly fund a podcast series and then use that idea to make a TV series about it later, I don't actually think it's a bad idea at all, provided that they're willing to kind of understand how much time and effort it takes to make a podcast, which is sort of what you were saying before, because I don't think there is much of an understanding of the amount of time it takes to make something really good, to make a really, really good podcast. It's more labour intensive than people think, but it's not cheap, but it's also far less expensive than making a TV series. So I think when production companies are used to these massive budgets, if you can come to them with a podcast budget, it's always going to be less. And so I think that's a sort of interesting way of looking at it too.
Yeah, we're having conversations with documentary production houses around piloting ideas and stories as a podcast, as a kind of, I guess, a launch pad to further development or further funding. It's an interesting idea, but yes, it's not like for peanuts. It's got to be for something. But yeah, but also like with that, and I'm really interested about the the parallel running TV show and podcast. It's kind of like with this cross-platform stuff. Like what's different about the podcast? Like how are they complementing? Like are you just repeating the same story across all these platforms, or is the podcast doing one thing that's kind of different and unique and interesting, and then the film or it goes off in another direction, and you kind of get a 360-degree storytelling experience without just kind of saming it? I don't know. I think that's a challenge.
That's actually a question I'd like to ask Alex, because of all the people on the panel, your platform, well, your suite of media products probably has the most different types of outcomes. From the blog to you have written a best-selling book, and you're now writing some other books.
Two more.
We can talk about that. Mm-hmm. And you're about to. When are you going to France?
January.
Right. It's about to go on a book tour to France in January with the first book. You also have e-learning courses and so forth. So you are not only breaking up the stories that you're telling and the information that you're providing into all kind of different types of products, but that's enabled you to monetize your podcast and your business as well. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was about 5 years into blogging that I sort of had about 10,000 people in the community, and I started to realise I was awake until 1 a.m. helping Betty find a non-toxic shampoo, helping Ken find a kettle that didn't have plastic in it. It was just all of these things. And I thought, I came from an executive salary to this, and it was a real reality check moment where I realised that I was changing people's lives, but I was not actually being able to sustain my own life financially. And it's something that a lot of people experience who really have art and passion at the core of what they do. I've seen it so many times. And so I thought, well, what if I could create an e-learning product that answered all these questions for all these people across every facet of daily life, and run it, 2-3 times a year, and get everybody in a Facebook group, answer all their questions over a really nice defined period of time, and then that's it. It's not available until the next quarter. And for the very first e-course that I ran, I had 360 people sign up. And I remember saying to my husband, "Oh my God, look at my PayPal balance. This is crazy." And I actually started to put my business hat back on and realise the potential of creating defined learning spaces depending on different people's goals. So whether, we've now got preconception ninja, inflammation ninja, low tox kids, real food rockstar, all these kind of courses that help people with goals in a time where we're more than ever confused about how to eat for our health, for the planet, and all of those sorts of things, as well as all the products we use. So we've now got 9 different e-courses, and that was the first way that we monetised. And one of the core values of the business is to obviously make it easy for people to make swaps. And the logical thing to do there is to partner with really fantastic ethical brands.
And when you say make swaps, what you're encouraging them to do is swap out a product in their life that's full of some terrible stuff.
Like endocrine disruptive chemicals or carcinogenic. There's a lot of science, unfortunately, to back much of what is in our day-to-day mainstream stuff.
So just switch out a traditional supermarket product full of frightening numbers with something else.
Totally.
And so you were saying you're working with those with brands.
Exactly, and they have to pass through a bazillion hoops to actually work with us, because ethics is also at the core of what we do. So we certainly don't take $1 at any point for a compromise. And so through the podcast, once that started, we had a monthly sponsorship. And so we're able to cover absolutely every dollar that we spend on production, hosting, my half day of research, preparing the questions, buying the book, all the things that we have to do to put that podcast together, which is really, really great. And it takes the stress off, can we actually put it together this month? And then other parts of the business fund wages and bigger stuff for the team now. But
In terms of your community, so podcasting is an inherently digital medium. People are downloading them for free and listening to them on their podcast app. If you haven't actually done this before and you don't know how, feel free to come and ask us afterwards, because I will teach you how to use it. But this is they must be digitally literate to get the podcast and listen to it in the first place, which means they know how to use mobile devices or computers. It probably means that they're on social media. You've attracted a pretty huge audience, and I think some of you have for your projects as well, enormous online audiences who reach out to you and want to interact with you. How do you navigate that, particularly with some of the, if you're part of an institution or if you're dealing with the crime, how does your community interaction with your fan base work for you?
So most people, no matter what the age group or demographic, manage Facebook these days. And I was, promoting the podcast. Everybody come join me there on iTunes and Spotify. And one lovely woman emailed me privately and said, "I've got no idea what you're talking about. Are you interviewing people? Where are these people talking to you, and how can I?" I was like, oh gosh, I've just missed that there's a whole bunch of people that have no idea how to connect to this medium. And so I recorded Facebook Lives once a week for a couple of months, and every now and then I'll do another one, and just kind of step people through, grab the iPhone out, grab the friend's Samsung so they see it on 2 different phones, what thing to click on, and I literally take people through, and you would be, like, your mind would be blown by how many people are so thankful for that. Because some people just didn't get the memo, and, a lot of us join things 3, 4, 5, 10 years after they've first been early adopted. So I'm really, as a bit of a tech Luddite who happened into online business myself, I have a real soft spot for people who find technology hard, and I always try and help people find it easier.
Do you folks have online communities that are interacting with you?
We do. The library's Facebook reach isn't huge, and most of the feedback that we're getting is through Apple Podcast, and people make suggestions and give some quite lovely feedback, but we haven't done a lot of, it's only been out for...
It's quite new things for you guys.
I just released the last episode on Monday.
I hope it helps you build community.
It's certainly, I hope so. We'll see what happens, but it's not something we sort of thought about or prepared for, to be honest. We kind of just wanted to put it out there and tell the story and cross-promote the exhibition and hope for the best. Like, we didn't know if anyone was going to listen to it, to be honest. So it's... it'll be interesting to see how it keeps going. But that's really very sensible what you've done.
A little how-to. Maybe you could pop one like
all together so that we can share the ideas.
But I also, because we were trying to reach a younger audience with it, which is kind of silly, I guess. Podcasting is, so many audience. I suppose demographically,
well, a lot of people who have the
who
time to listen to. Like endless amounts tend to be a little older as well. One of my big demographics is 60 to 75, and it's a lot of grandparents who didn't have to deal with any of the crazy things their kids are dealing with these days, with allergies and chronic disease, and much more robust because life was a lot simpler agriculturally and chemically. And so that's a huge part of our audience, and they're wanting to do the best for the rest of their family while they've got more time on their hands to support. So, that's probably why it was like a necessary thing.
But that's that's largely the library's demographic, so why shouldn't we be? The library actually runs across the state, like workshops for people to come in and
don't know how to access podcasts.
Well, and figure out the internet.
What about you, Ruby?
That's what we do.
Oh, for us, part of Unravel's remit was to go for the age demographic of 18 to 35-year-olds, which is a demographic the ABC, I think, misses a lot. So I think we just assumed that they all knew how to use podcasts. So in that sense, it wasn't something I thought about till much later on when the podcast actually started to go out. And then the ways that people got in touch with me were really interesting. The amount of people who got in touch, first of all, was really surprising. We didn't really set up for it. We didn't prepare for it. We hoped, we really hoped that people would get in touch, but you can't predict that. And I was quite overwhelmed. I don't know what the final figure was, but it was hundreds of people. And a lot of it was over email. We had lots and lots of people emailing us. And then we just had people trying to find us in real life. And these, I think, were the older people who were listening. But, there were people who lived in Sydney. I think one person, he found Neil at Neil's local pub. So
that's creepy. That's not spooky.
This is why history is safe.
I think that's a real testament to the medium, though, because I think the relationship that a listener will develop with a host, because of the intimacy of being in someone's ears and listening like it's a conversation, just you and me. There's a very deep kind of connection and intimacy is very overused in podcasting, but it is an intimate kind of connection. And I think podcast listeners are kind of hardcore. When they like something, they will and
As
Discovery.
Someone who runs a fan cast, I can definitely confirm that.
Yeah,
and Discovery is one of the biggest obstacles of podcasting, but the single biggest point or way that people are discovering is word of mouth. And it's like we have a lot of, or I'm probably pretty nerdy when it comes to these things, but like, you know, everyone's been at the pub where you like bring out your phones and you start sharing podcasts and you're subscribing, and there's something very cultish about audiences and sharing of podcasts, which I think is about, a lot of it is to do with that like host relationship and fanning out and
there's definitely
stalking.
a lot of trust built up, I think, between you and the person listening. And I realised that once I started to get back in touch with people who got in touch with me. And, you know, normally when you're a journalist and you start talking to people, you spend a lot of time building the relationship and getting to know them. And, you know, you wouldn't automatically just start asking them about a traumatic thing that's happened to them. You would never do that. But what I found was when the podcast started going out, all these women started to get in touch with me who had lived on the northern beaches, and they would just start talking. They would just start saying, this is what happened to me. I want to be able to help you. And, you know, I got the sense that the trust was there. They'd listened to the podcast, they knew my voice, and they were just ready to talk. And that's never happened to me before. And I think that is because of, because of a lot of things, but a large part of it is that, you know, that sense of, you know, you're feeling close to someone because, you know, they're in your ears, like as you're doing something.
And they know that you'll believe them and that you'll understand.
That too,
And they're anonymous, they're faceless. Like, I think that's a big thing in terms of sharing.
What we might do now is throw to the interview with Hedley Thomas. So this is about 10 minutes long, so relax and have a listen. To set this up for you, if you could raise your hand, has anyone listened to The Teacher's Pet? Cool, we have a few of you. Unfortunately, you cannot currently access this podcast in Australia at the moment because the impact of it has been so great that one of the main characters is now standing trial for murder. And so in order not to prejudice his case, the team has voluntarily removed the podcast so that jurors don't listen to it and perhaps form an opinion prior to when they should do that. So Hedley, who is the presenter and producer of The Teacher's Pet and the investigative reporter who looked into this case and essentially had it reopened after a very long period of time, is one of the chief reporters for the Australian newspaper. He's based in Brisbane. So he wasn't able to join us on the panel tonight, and also he's not really able to speak in a live environment about this because of the case. But what he did do was give me 10 minutes of his time recently. So we've pre-recorded an interview. We'll have a quick listen to it now. And while you're listening, if you could please formulate any questions that you have for the panel, and afterwards pop over to the microphone over here. We'll have some questions and then we'll go to the pub. So, Alan, over to you and Hedley Thomas.
Crime reporting and investigative journalism have often had substantive impacts on policing, like bringing forward new witnesses or new evidence or causing cold cases to be reopened. The Teacher's Pet has had over 50 million downloads now, and Hedley Thomas's work on it for The Australian won him a gold Walkley. Chris Dawson's now standing trial for murder. Do you think, Hedley, that the true crime podcast documentary approach to telling this story created a bigger impact than print journalism alone could have? And if you think so, why is that?
Yeah, I do think so, Felicity. And that's because there's an intimacy with podcast journalism, particularly when it's in long form, when listeners can hear the voices of people who care deeply about a loved one, and they are taken on a bit of a journey. And I don't think that's possible with much print journalism. Certainly in an extended piece, such as a magazine story, you can make a connection, but there's a very different connection when you are listening to these people's voices and hearing the heartbreak that they've experienced. And I'm not talking necessarily about my podcast. I'm talking across the board in this kind of story.
Do you think that a serialised narrative plays a part in that? That people are coming back week after week and they start to feel like they get to know you as a presenter and that they know the characters and the police officers and the people that they hear about in the story?
Yeah, it's a bit like the old-fashioned radio serial. And instead of what many of us have become used to, which is binging on a TV series and watching or listening to half a dozen episodes over a day or a weekend if we've got the time. This was necessarily staged over a number of consecutive weeks, and I think that it wasn't done to sort of try to generate more listeners. It was done that way because of the amount of time it took and the leads that needed to be followed up between episodes. But I think it had the effect of causing people to consider what they'd listened to and dwell on it and sit on it and sit with it and mull it over and then wait for the next episode.
Speaking of the amount of time that it took to create, I understand that The Teacher's Pet was at least a 6-month project for you. Do podcast documentaries provide journalists with better opportunities to undertake deep dive, long-form investigations, and how was that supported by your editors at The Australian?
Well, it undoubtedly does give that opportunity, and I was really fortunate that my editors supported it wholeheartedly and continue to support me in this kind of journalism. And that's obviously fundamental, to be able to carve out that amount of time to do one major story, albeit in many, many different parts, because we did many dozens of newspaper and web stories based on revelations that were being disclosed. But it's not possible without very significant backup. We're traditionally a print media company. This was quite new for us. We'd done some very successful podcasts. My colleague Dan Box did the podcast Bowerville, and that really was I think a very impressive example of what could be done by a traditional newspaper with the journalistic backup that the editors give. And this exercise involved more support, and I was lucky I got it in spades.
And the podcasts must be going very well for The Australian because, of course, we also have Greg Berup's Who the Hell is Hamish? So is The Australian planning to continue in this vein, to your knowledge, of doing these kind of podcast stories? They seem very popular.
Yeah, I think that The Australian and my colleagues, certainly myself, are really keen to do more of these kinds of stories. And I think that they can serve a really worthwhile purpose in society, because there are so many cases involving people who have disappeared, and sadly time marches on, and police being busy or distracted by other significant crimes that might appear to be easier to solve can not always turn a blind eye, but unfortunately pursue other things. And these cases can fall through the cracks, and it doesn't make it any easier for the people left behind that their loved one is missing, presumed having met with foul play. It actually, I think, makes it a lot harder, because the not knowing can be much more difficult to deal with than the recovery of a body. I think that once people have certainty about what happened to somebody that they've loved and longed for, it makes the grieving process easier. But the uncertainty, the not knowing, which is what you have in these cases involving missing people, that is really like a daily trauma for families.
There are so many ethical implications in that kind of storytelling, aren't there, as well, in dealing with families empathetically. And the popularity of the true crime genre is fascinating. Like, the unfolding nature of an investigation structurally lends itself to the unfolding nature of a serialised story or a piece of investigative journalism. But we do need to bear in mind that these are real people and these are real lives we're dealing with, although I imagine it might not be possible for you to speak about that very much given the nature of the ongoing case.
Look, I think generally it's incumbent on journalists and their media organisations to be respectful of the loss that has been suffered by the people who are the subject of these sorts of stories. And to recognise, and in my experience this is what does happen, to recognise that while there might be commercial upside to the story, that needs to be contextually understood in light of the fact that there has been a terrible loss that continues, and you should be mindful of that at all times, and also be dealing with members of the family with the I think thoughtfulness and kindness and humility that they really deserve, given the loss that they've suffered.
Very good advice indeed. And can I ask you briefly about your co-producer, Slade Gibson, who is the other Gold Walkley winner with you, and about your production process, because in some cases you needed to go physically to interview people and then put this together in the studio later. Can you tell us about Slade's work on this?
Yeah, Slade's such a interesting guy, having been a very successful musician and then a sound engineer. He played guitar for Savage Garden and toured the world, and now has a successful business in Brisbane, where he does post-production work and pre-production work and sound engineering for various corporations. But he hadn't done a podcast before, so we teamed up fairly late in the piece and just clicked.
Did you know each other beforehand?
Only for a very brief period beforehand, and we hit it off straight away, and he was so giving, not just with time, but with his own ideas and insights. And he's not a journalist, but he had a very perceptive eye and ear on what was happening and gave me some really good advice.
Just in closing, this podcast and all of the crimes and misdemeanours and hurtful behaviour that it covers has landed in the Me Too era, and it's actually directly motivated a number of listeners to speak out about their sexual assault, particularly sexual abuse by teaching staff in their schools. And this has happened in areas throughout New South Wales, and you probably would know of others. What are your reflections on the social impact results of this podcast? What do they mean to you personally?
Well, I think before I answer that, I should just say again that, as you mentioned, Chris Dawson has been charged with murder, and there's an ongoing proceeding. And since that charge was levelled, he has a presumption of innocence in our criminal justice system, and he's denied wrongdoing. And I think that needs to be stated again, just on, in fairness to him. But at the same time as that process is unfolding, there is a very strong push from many people who have hopes that journalists like myself can cover cases that are close to their own heart, involving their own experiences or the disappearances of people close to them, people who they suspect have met with foul play. And so the contacts that I receive from these people are really very moving, because they've listened to my podcast and they've obviously been moved somewhat by it and hold out hope that an outcome could be achievable if theirs is adopted. And I think that when all of these sorts of cases, if they could be done by a number of journalists, I can't do more than one at a time, but if more of these could be done, the impacts could be quite significant. Of course, some of these cases may never be solved, but I think if media resources, more resources, could be actually dedicated to this kind of long-form podcast journalism and these deep dives into unsolved cases, it's quite possible that they could be solved. And I'd like to continue trying to do that myself.
And when the outcome of the case is finally reached, will Australian listeners be able to hear The Teacher's Pet again, do we think?
Yes.
Excellent, good to hear it. Hedley Thomas, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. So if you haven't yet been able to listen to the Teacher's Pet podcast, we hope you are able to very soon. Does anyone in the audience have any questions for the panel?
So I guess my question was a little bit more open. In all forms of media, anytime we use someone's likeness, we talk about the ideas of consent. And I was hoping to get perspectives and processes on what consent would look like for podcasting from that very startup level through to a very professional organisation.
Generally, when we're doing like a documentary style thing, we get verbal consent. So at the beginning of the tape, without cutting it into a separate track, I'd start saying, so just to reiterate, we're having this conversation for X documentary that I'm creating for this broadcaster about general topic. Are you okay with me using this audio in that context? And then they say yes, and it's like the worst, most unromantic way to start an interview. And then you just like talk about cooking for or whatever. Yeah, it is. It's a bit like, so that's sort of like what I used to do, but now when we work with Audible, they are very uptight about releases. I shouldn't say uptight, vigilant. So we have to have a written release for everyone, and if they're not released, they can't be used.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because if you listen to podcasts in the US, it's always like ring, 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 and they answer, and like you're off, right? Yeah. And you can't do that because you can't record someone without their permission, right? So I think we always had kind of, people would sign off on consent forms with us, and then the way that you get those more, I guess, natural moments with people is with documentary, when you're spending a lot of time with them, right? So like the way that we, I think, ended up operating was once we kind of had their consent, the process evolved, and therefore you'd turn up at their house and they'd see you recording and they'd know you're recording, and so you'd get all your nice kind of interactions that way, I guess. But yeah.
Oh, we just have a standard release at the library that is a general clearance that says we can put it in the collection, we can do whatever we want with it at any time. If a contributor for some reason didn't want it to go beyond that particular project, then I would go away and, rewrite it very happily so that it was just for that specific project. But generally people just sign a standard release. Yeah. Which is a library document. Yeah.
Mm. I don't have a library document, but so for us it just really looks like a standard consent form where we ask questions like, is there anywhere we're not allowed to go within your expertise live? Because I do a lot of tangenting, like in the moment, and then just start drilling when something's really interesting. And then I also say at the end of the recording, we'll then have a private chat where you can veto anything that came up that you want to renege on, and my producer can cut it out for us. So they really feel very safe going for it in the moment, but then reviewing it afterwards. And actually a couple of times I've interviewed journalists, and they are the most fantastic at going, nope, that thing that I said at 13 minutes, 22 seconds, it's actually not 8.1 billion, it's 8.3 billion. If you could change it, just really... Such control freaks. I wasn't going to say it, but I really appreciate that as someone who wants to put out as factual a piece as possible. Yeah. So yeah, that's what we do.
They'll be like, oh, just wait, I'll start that again. And then they'll give me the whole grab. It's like terrible.
Thank you, that was a great question.
When pitching a podcast to an organisation, one of the key questions is how you're going to promote it after it's completed. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations on how to do that without relying on social media, perhaps? Yeah.
I think what Kate said before is very true. I reckon it's all about word of mouth. And I know that's not a great reason
it's a tough way
perhaps to
pitch
give in a pitch, but I reckon it's so much what it's all about with podcasting. You've got to do it to a level of quality and obviously choose your content wisely so it's something that is going to have that traction. But certainly that's, from the analytics that we've gathered, that word of mouth is, for the exhibition and for the podcast, it's way above what we would normally get. And I think it's just because of the content. But I think that it's not a pitching answer, perhaps.
It's a pretty tough measurement tool, word of mouth, and it's hard. It's always a really awkward conversation, to be honest. It's one of our greatest barriers in terms of how are we communicating the work we do, because we can make a really great thing, but often it's up to the client to promote and amplify it. And so I think what we're doing a lot more of over the last year is really connecting with the marketing team straight up and getting them really excited and on board. it's like looking at all the distribution channels and like making sure it's across all the platforms and it's accessible and discoverable in as many places as possible, because most of them are free, so you might as well sign up for them. But yeah, I think it's like thinking about a strategy, like a distribution strategy, and like depending on the client, I'd be asking them, what are your existing channels? Where are you engaging with your audience already? How could you use those and utilize those to, like, you know, talk about your podcast? If you're working with someone like the ABC or Audible, they have like existing kind of marketing teams and like a lot of online presence and platforms, so it's a lot easier. But for smaller, like not-for-profit or government organisations, that's where you really have to get the comms and marketing team like in and on board, and you have to get them really excited about the content so that they're going to gun for it.
And it does depend on the sort of podcast you have, I suppose. But I think for me, the way that we were trying to, get people listening to us was through the ground rule breaking. So if your podcast is investigative in any sort of way, the way that people will find you is if you make any sort of development on a case and you have something worth talking about. But I think that's quite specific to investigative podcasts rather than more broad ones. But that's the point at which people will start taking notice, I think.
And another way that I've found to broaden our reach on certain topics is, let's say I've interviewed a professor on glyphosate, for example, then I'll get in touch with the Gene Australia Action Group, the Food Alliance, Australian Organic, and I'll present them that we did a show on XYZ recently. You know, if you wanted to share that with your audience, we reckon there might be a few people interested in it and they'll possibly share it. So thinking about what problem you're solving for communities that are also trying to solve those problems means you can actually tap into reach that other people have on certain topics that you might not have.
Yes, Alex is using a social impact campaign distribution strategy there by figuring out who your audience is for your subject and engaging with that audience. Where do they live? And of course there's also the general podcast listening audience. So are you approaching an audience community who's already engaged with your subject matter, or people who like podcasts and trying to get them involved with your subject matter? And that does tend to be contingent on social media communities. And there are, podcast listening groups that you can go into, but self-promotion is not generally welcomed in those. But another popular approach is to build a relationship with podcast producers and ask for a shout out. Can you guest on, it depends on what kind of show you're making, but can you guest on somebody's show? Is there something similar where you think you would share an audience? The production atmosphere at this time is still collegiate enough that people don't necessarily see you as competition. They see you as somebody that they can cross-promote with and connect with. So you could find, you often hear on a podcast someone talking about another show that's similar in nature that their fans might like, and that is a really popular technique to promote as well.
Hi. I have a question that is probably relevant to all forms of documentary, not just podcasting, but I'd love to know your thoughts about the grey area or fine line that you sort of have to walk between creating something factual and has inherent value, especially deep diving journalism that can uncover, great results that can impact on people's lives greatly, or, not just journalism, but how you walk that line between that valuable thing and creating something that's also entertainment.
Sorry, that's really triggering. We're doing a fact check at the moment on a project that we're working on. I probably can't talk about it openly, but it's like a comedian talent-led piece, but he doesn't identify as a journalist or hasn't kind of said this is an investigative piece, but he's coming up against some really heavy storytelling, and we've got this epic fact-checking document that's going with someone who's ex-ABC and used to working in investigative journalism, and it is just a nightmare. And so we're talking a lot about that editorially. It's what compromises are we making around, what's factual versus what's great storytelling? How important is it that we know were there 3 people at this particular event versus 5? It's just that kind of stuff, and you can really go down a rabbit hole with the detail. I mean, you would know about this because I can't imagine what the fact-checking exercise was like for you guys, but
I did it.
Oh my God.
But I mean, because I come from that journalism background, I'm just really unrelenting on that side of things. So, there were a lot of fights though, because the way it was made was I was the one that was out there doing all the interviews, collecting everything, and then after the TV and podcast production was done, I came back to the ABC and I worked with a producer and a supervising producer who hadn't been there for that whole time, and so they sat down with me and we started the writing process, and they would write stuff that and I could see now why they did it, because it was all about the structure of the podcast, but they were writing stuff that was not correct, and it just it was really, really difficult. We got there in the end, and we have a good relationship now and everyone likes everyone, but there is this tension between journalism and narrative, there just is, and people want to fit journalism into a story arc and it doesn't always fit. And I mean, from where I come from, you just I'm on the side of journalism, but there is, you do need to make a story compelling because you want people to listen, right? There's no point just having a list of facts and figures. It has to be a story that people want to listen to and that people will care about. And so there's definitely a tension there. And I think, there were so many conversations that I had last year where, I don't know what else to say about that, but it's a really good question.
I think I thought about this a lot, especially in terms of using music. I mean, you want people to emotionally engage with what you're talking about. That's the whole sort of box and dice, really, what we were trying to do. And I know that sometimes people don't like hearing voices from history, especially that were in the written record. They're all going to be in the written record where there were no voice recordings, but they don't like hearing them dramatised. They don't like it when you attach music to something, when you push something emotionally, when you try to manipulate your audience. But without that, how do you create that connection? It's going to be dry. It's going to be... So in the end, I sort of just had to put that aside and I suppose just try not to over-egg it and just be a bit sensitive and think. I was thinking about that stuff all the time, but I suppose it's just too about having respect for your content and not wanting to create something that's a farce. It was sort of, we were really worried, especially in terms of dramatising these voices, that it was going to be farcical or garish or too much getting into a certain sort of genre, I suppose, that we didn't want it to go. So it was sort of about always checking back in and checking back in and checking back in and listening again trying to listen again with fresh ears as much as we could within the time period that we had, and stripping back and until you were at a place where it was no, this is okay. Well, hoping it was okay. Because I think without those little... And I mean, I suppose it is a manipulation, but it's an awful word, but... how else do you take your audience there? How else do you do that? I don't know, maybe I'm just not a skilled enough producer, but I think that it's necessary sometimes.
So I just want to ask about how important you find the sound design and getting those sound effects in, because I love when a story kind of makes me feel like I'm actually there, the crunching of the gravel, that kind of thing. How important is that, and balancing that with the music and with the story, and how do you get that right balance?
We have a sound designer. He's amazing. His name's Martin Browder, and he. I didn't understand how important he was until I listened to the first episode after he had gone over it, and he did bring it to life. He really did. I was so focused on the people that I was interviewing and on the facts that I was trying to stack up, and the things that I could prove on the journalism side of it. And I was aware of needing to get really good sound and needing to take people to a place, but it wasn't until I heard what a good sound designer can do, and how that can kind of transform your experience of a story, that I really understood how important it is, I think it's hugely important.
I think it's everything. So, I mean, I think if you're not I shouldn't say that, but I guess I should just say personally, I think it's everything, because if you're not using the capacity of sound to take someone somewhere or to create an immersive experience, to draw on like the emotional triggers that sound can bring, even if it's just tonal and not atmospheric or literal or real sound, I think it's a missed opportunity, because it's like one of the best things about sound. And once you start playing with that and getting creative with that, and it's pretty exciting. Yeah.
What's some of the best sound design you've ever heard in a podcast?
Oh, God, that's a hard one. I'm listening to a lot of audio fiction at the moment, and I'm actually really enjoying like really cinematic approaches to sound. There's one that I'm listening to at the moment, which you should hear, is called Carrier. It's American, but it's great, and it's like a woman who's a truck driver, and it's got all the great tropes of a good fiction, because it's like CB radios and like voice calls and like road kind of conversations on road trips where two people are probably looking somewhere. But even that, like, I'm talking about it as a space, and it's like the sound design has taken me there. I'm a co-collaborator in creating this world. It's all in my mind's eye. I'm imagining what that person's like, what the truck's like, where they're going, how they're feeling, are they sweating because they're so panicked. Like, I just think it's so, I mean, they talk about audio being the most visual medium, and I think it's because of that mind's eye and what you can bring to you in your own imagination. I get very excited about this stuff.
Sabrina, you have some great audio design in your show as well. Did you have anything to add?
I think the exhibition's audio design is gorgeous, and it was something that we had budgeted for the exhibition, where we hadn't really for the podcast. So it was sort of, I mean, I can really hear, it's like screams at me where it's missing in the podcast, and I just hate that I didn't have the skills or the time or whatever, because we were able to pay for it to be mixed, and Julian sort of, I knew because he'd done the exhibition that he had certain things, he had certain pre-prepared scapes that he could drop in, and then at other moments it was as simple as, you know, a hammer nailing into wood that you'd want for the coffin to be nailed, and that's all you need to kind of, or a spade splicing into sand, and that's so visceral that it's all you need. So I guess what I'm saying is I agree completely, and I wish that I had addressed that better before I had started, because, or at least understood it better before I'd started. Yeah.
It is good to be a little restrained though, because you can get drunk on this stuff. You're like, oh, all of the sound effects and stuff like that, and you, like, I know.
And you stop paying attention.
Yeah. It's like, what's most important? Is it the voice and the story that we need to be with now, and like how are we bringing tone in gently under it to shift a mood or a feeling in that moment? Like, it's sort of, it's to be considered, and restraint's very good. It's
really difficult to get it right as well. Like, Julian would put a sound on something that was supposed to be the noise of construction, and I would sit there and I'm like, what does that sound like? It sounds like the Titanic falling apart. It sounds like metal straining. That's, you know, like, and sort of have these conversations with him. It was really interesting about, you know, how different people hear or perceive different things, and just because it's come out of his grab bag that might be labelled in a certain way, I'm coming at it from a layman's perspective, I suppose, as a listener myself, because saying that's not quite right. So I think that's true, that you can go too far, and you can, you know, especially if there's repetition in this, like a bird calling or whatever. I'm like, get rid of the crow. We don't need the crow, because you just hear this, and you just like, no, shut it down. We're not listening to the story about infanticide anymore. It's too serious. We cannot have that squawking in the background. So it's it's a great process though.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another fantastic question. Well, it's about time for us to bring this evening to an end. I'd like to thank everybody on the OzDox committee, and we'd love for you to join our conversation online. Come along. We do these every month. We are www.ozdocs.org, OzDocs Forum on Instagram, OzDocs.Australian Documentary Forum on Facebook is our page, and we also have a group where you can hang out and ask questions. That is groups/OzDocs community. So thanks to the team for supporting this panel for happening tonight, and our friends at the ADG and Afters and DAF, the Documentary Australia Foundation, and of course Alan, the Phantom of the Cinema, Alan Butterfield, our wonderful projectionist up there in the back. And I'd also like to thank my partner Dion Brooks for his help with the panel and its preparation. And thank you so much to all of you and to our guests. Thank you and good night.